I work at a remote weather station. These are my night shift rules. The card was laminated. Somebody had taken the time to laminate it, which meant somebody had considered it permanent, which meant the rules on it were not suggestions. I remember thinking that. I remember holding it under the desk lamp on my first night and thinking, someone wanted these to last. There were supposed to be 11 rules. I know that because the previous tech, a man named Ardell, who I never met, who left 3 days before I arrived, had written 11 rules, laminated, left on desk in the handover notes. 11. He'd underlined it. Not for emphasis, I think now. As a count. As a thing to verify. I counted 13. I set the card down. I picked it up again. I counted slowly, running my finger along each line the way you do when you're certain you miscounted and you want to catch yourself. 1 through 11 were printed in the same black type, the same font, the same laminate sheen. They looked original. They looked like they'd been there a while. 12 and 13 were handwritten. The ink on 12 had that slightly raised quality that ballpoint leaves on laminate it had been written after the card was sealed. Somebody had written on the outside of the laminate, which meant somebody had written it here. At this station, after Ardell made his handover notes and before I arrived, in the 3 days between us. I looked at 13. The handwriting on 12 and 13 was the same slant, same pressure, same habit of leaving the tail of the letter G open rather than looping it closed. I have that habit. I have had it since I learned to write. I had never been to this station before in my life. I set the card face down on the desk and I sat very still for a moment, listening to the instrument's hum. And then I picked it back up because I am not the kind of man who leaves things face down. I read Rule 12. Do not read Rule 12 until your third night. I read it again. Then I read 13, which I will tell you about later because Rule 13 is the end of this story and I am not ready to give you the end yet. I need you to understand the beginning first. I need you to understand what kind of man I was when I arrived here, and what kind of station this is, and what the rules are actually for. Because when I say the rules saved my life, I am not being dramatic and I am not being metaphorical. I mean that the rules written in my own handwriting, in ink that should not have been there, were the only reason I am sitting here writing this now, instead of being a set of instrument readings that don't quite agree with the automated output, off by a consistent margin that nobody can explain. Let me start with the station. The formal name is RWOS7, which stands for Remote Weather Observation Station 7, which is a designation that tells you almost nothing except that there are at least 6 others, and that this one is far enough from anything else to need a number instead of a name. It sits at 4,000 and change feet in the eastern slope country, well above the valley floor, below the Sirius alpine elevation. In that in-between zone that the trees haven't quite committed to, there are conifers, but they're sparse and they lean. And they've been shaped by decades of prevailing wind into something that looks less like trees and more like a crowd of peoples all turning to look at the same thing. The building itself is a prefab equipment shelter, maybe 20 feet by 30, with a metal roof and a concrete pad and anchor bolts that go 4 feet into the ground because the wind up here doesn't ask permission. Inside there's a desk, a chair, a cot, a 2-burner propane stove, a CB radio and a satellite phone that functions as a backup to the backup, a bank of instrument readouts along the north wall, and a logbook that goes back about 11 years, depending on which entry you consider the first legitimate one. 30 meters to the northwest, out the main door, and across a gravel apron that I want to tell you crunches a certain way. Underfoot, not just dry gravel, something more specific than that, like the gravel is slightly hollow, like it's covering something that isn't solid is the instrument shelter. Smaller, just big enough to stand inside. It holds the primary sensor array, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, wind speed and direction, precipitation gauges, everything that gets transmitted automatically every 15 minutes to the regional forecasting office. My job was to verify the automated readings manually 4 times per 12-hour shift. 6 p.m., midnight, 3 a.m., and 6 a.m. I would go to the instrument shelter, take manual readings with a separate calibrated set of instruments, Log them in the paper logbook. Compare them to the automated output for the same timestamp. Note any discrepancy greater than the acceptable margin, and radio in a summary at the end of the shift. If the automated and manual readings agreed within tolerance, great. If they didn't, I flagged it and the regional office decided what to do with the discrepancy. This is real work. It exists. During fire season, during flood watch windows, during certain high-consequence forecast events, the automated systems are not enough, not because they malfunction, but because the cost of a systematic error during an active emergency is too high to trust any single system. You need a human set of eyes and hands. You need someone who can tell you that the sensor agrees with what the air actually feels like, what the sky actually looks like, what the ground actually smells like after rain. I had done this work before. Different stations, different elevations, different seasons. I was competent. I was reliable. I had good calibration instincts, the ability to read a number and know from experience and from the feel of a place whether it was plausible, whether it made sense. I had stopped trusting those instincts about 18 months before I arrived at RWOS 7. That is the other thing you need to know about me. I'll come back to it. The contract was for 14 nights, 2 weeks of overnight shifts, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., after which a relief tech would come in and I would drive back down the access road to the valley and sleep in a real bed and eat something that didn't come from a can. Standard rotation. Ardell's handover notes were brief and professional. Equipment status, calibration dates, propane level, water supply. The logbook was current. The radio had been finicky on the 2 nights prior to his departure, but had settled. Wildlife activity had been moderate deer at the edge of the floodlight range, once what he thought was a black bear working the slope above the instrument shelter. He'd noted the appropriate precautions. Make noise when moving between buildings, keep food sealed, don't leave the main door open. And then, at the bottom of the handover notes, in the same careful printing as everything else, 11 rules, laminated, left on desk. Follow them in order, don't skip ahead. I found the card. I counted 13 rules, and my first night at RWOS 7 began. I want to tell you about the rules in order because that's how I learned them, and the order matters. Rule 1. Conduct all 4 manual readings on schedule. Do not skip a reading. Do not combine readings. If conditions make a reading dangerous, radio the regional office before deciding to skip. Reasonable, standard. The kind of rule that exists because someone once skipped a reading and something went wrong. Rule 2. When moving between the main shelter and the instrument shelter after dark, keep the floodlights on. Do not turn them off to save power. The generator runs on a 10-day fuel cycle. Power conservation is not your concern. Also reasonable. The floodlights illuminate the 30-meter path between the 2 buildings. Moving in darkness at 4,000 feet, on an uneven gravel apron, with wind that can gust to 30 miles an hour without warning, is how people twist ankles, and worse. Keep the lights on, fine. Rule 3. Do not leave the instrument shelter door open while taking readings. Take your readings, note them, and close the door behind you before you leave. I thought about this one for a moment. The instrument shelter door has a simple latch, not a lock, just a latch. Leaving it open in high wind could damage the instruments, but the rule said after dark, specifically, and it said behind you, which implies closing it as you exit, not just while you're inside. I filed it as wind damage prevention and moved on. Rule 4. Log every reading in the paper logbook, including readings that fall within acceptable tolerance. Do not summarize, do not abbreviate. Write each value in full. Tedious but understandable. Paper records as a complete parallel trail. Nothing surprising here. Rule 5. If the automated output and your manual reading disagree by more than the acceptable margin, note the discrepancy. Do not attempt to determine which reading is correct. Log both values and move on. This one I read twice. The standard protocol is to flag discrepancies and then check the instruments for obvious faults. Try to determine the source of the error. Rule 5 said specifically, do not attempt to determine which reading is correct. Just log both and move on. It felt like a rule written by someone who had spent time trying to determine which reading was correct and had found the exercise, I don't know, fruitless, or worse than fruitless. Rule 6. Do not stand outside the instrument shelter after completing a reading. Take your readings, log them inside the shelter, leave promptly. I noted the word promptly, not quickly, not immediately, promptly. Which is a word with a specific professional flavor. It implies timeliness without urgency, but also implies that delay is not neutral. Delay has a cost. I didn't know what cost. I assumed it was about exposure to elements. I moved on. Rule 7. The logbook from the previous text rotation is in the lower desk drawer. You may read it. You do not need to read it. Your shift is your shift. I found this one interesting. Not a prohibition you may read it, but also a clear signal that reading it was not required and carried some implication. The phrase "your shift" is your shift felt like a fence around something. I opened the lower desk drawer. There was a logbook there, olive green cover, labeled with Ardell's name and the rotation dates. I put it on the desk. I did not open it that night. Rule 8. At the midnight reading after you return to the main shelter, sit for 10 minutes before you do anything else. You do not need to do anything during these 10 minutes. Sit. 10 minutes of sitting. I checked my watch when I came back from the midnight reading, and I sat in the desk chair and I looked at the instrument panel and I sat. It felt, and I am aware of how this sounds, it felt like a decompression rule. Like a rule that existed because something about the midnight reading, or the walk back from it, required a settling period. I did not know what. The first night, the 10 minutes felt like nothing. Just 10 minutes. Rule 9. If you hear something on the slope above the instrument shelter, do not use the floodlights to look for the source. Note the time and continue your shift. Wildlife. Had to be about wildlife. Bears, maybe. The logic being, don't illuminate the animal, don't engage, don't escalate. Note the time so there's a record. Continue. I accepted this. Rule 10. Do not use the satellite phone except in a genuine emergency. The CB radio is your primary communication. If the CB radio fails, wait 1 hour before using the satellite phone. A failed CB radio is not an emergency. Administrative. Fine. Rule 11. At the end of your shift, before your relief arrives, write a complete handover note. Include equipment status, any anomalous readings, wildlife activity, and any changes to the instrument shelter. Do not include personal observations or interpretations, facts only. And then, in different ink, on the outside of the laminate, handwritten in the slanted open G script that I recognized as my own. Rule 12. Do not read Rule 12 until your third night. And below it, Rule 13. Which I read once and then placed face down again, and which I am not going to tell you yet. The first night passed the way first nights at remote stations usually pass, slowly and with a low-grade alertness that doesn't quite tip into anxiety. You're in a new place. The sounds are unfamiliar. The rhythm of the instruments, the cycling of the automated data transmission, the faint relay click every 15 minutes takes time to become background noise rather than foreground intrusion. I did my 6 p.m. reading. Temperature, humidity, pressure, wind. Everything logged. Automated and manual agreed within tolerance. I ate something from a can. I read a paperback I'd brought. I did my midnight reading. The gravel was exactly as described, that slightly hollow quality underfoot. Not quite right, like walking on a drum. The floodlights threw hard shadows from the sparse trees, and the shadows moved when the wind moved the branches, and there was a period of about 4 seconds, walking back from the instrument shelter, when the wind died completely and the shadows stopped and the only sound was my own footsteps. And I had the distinct and unscientific impression that the quiet was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something listening. Then the wind came back. The shadows moved. I went inside and sat for 10 minutes per Rule 8, and the 10 minutes were just 10 minutes. I heard something on the slope above the instrument shelter at approximately 2:17 a.m. Not a specific sound, not a branch cracking or an animal call. More like a displacement, like the quality of the silence above the shelter changed. became occupied. The way a room feels different when someone walks into it even before you turn around. I noted the time per Rule 9. I did not turn on the floods to look. My 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. readings both came in within tolerance. I wrote my handover note, facts only, per Rule 11. Equipment nominal, readings within tolerance, possible wildlife activity at 2:17, no issues. I slept until mid-afternoon, woke, ate, and waited for 6 p.m. The second night, I opened Ardell's logbook. I want to be precise about why. It wasn't boredom. It wasn't the rule's implicit permission. It was the readings. My 6 p.m. readings on night 2 came in within tolerance, but when I compared them to the automated output, I noticed something I had not expected. The discrepancy between my manual reading and the automated reading was exactly 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit in temperature, and exactly 2 millibars in barometric pressure, and exactly 4% in relative humidity. Not approximately, not roughly, exactly. The same margin in each variable at the same time stamp. I told myself, instrument calibration. My calibrated set and the automated sensors had a consistent offset. It happened. It was within the acceptable margin. I logged both values per Rule 5 and moved on. But at the midnight reading, the discrepancy was exactly the same. Same values, same direction, my readings were consistently slightly higher than the automated output. 0.3 degrees, 2 millibars, 4% humidity, on 4 separate instruments at 2 separate timestamps, 6 hours apart. The probability of that being calibration drift is low. Calibration drift doesn't produce the same offset across different instrument types simultaneously. Temperature sensors drift differently than pressure sensors, which drift differently than humidity sensors. To get the same consistent margin across all 3, you'd need a systematic error in my calibration set, which would require all my instruments to have drifted the same way, the same amount, at the same time, which is possible technically. But it felt wrong. It felt the way wrong numbers feel when you've spent enough time with numbers, not catastrophically wrong, not even obviously wrong. Just wrong in the way that a room is slightly too cold, in the way that a shadow falls slightly too long. I opened Ardell's logbook. His entries were meticulous. He was clearly a methodical man, more detailed in his logging than the rules strictly required. Each entry included not just the readings, but the conditions during the walk wind level, visibility, ground status, wet, dry, frost. He'd noted wildlife encounters with specificity, dates, times, locations relative to the shelter, whether the animals had responded to his presence or ignored it. I scanned backward through his rotation, looking for discrepancies, looking for the pattern I'd found in my own readings. It took me about 40 minutes to find it, and when I found it, I sat with it for a while before I wrote anything down. Ardell's discrepancies were also consistent, but they were not the same as mine. His were exactly 0.4 degrees, 3 millibars, and 5% humidity. His manual readings were also consistently higher than the automated output. A different margin, but the same shape, the same systematic skew in the same direction. I went back further. The logbook before Ardell's was a woman named Uli, whose rotation had ended about 7 weeks before Ardell's began. Her discrepancy margin, 0.2 degrees, 1 millibar, 3% humidity. Mine was between Ardell's and Yule's values and beyond both of them, pushing further from the automated baseline than either of them had recorded. Each tech's manual readings were consistently higher than the automated output. The margin was different for each tech. The margin was increasing over time. I sat with that for a long time. Then I thought about Rule 5. Do not attempt to determine which reading is correct. Not the discrepancy is within tolerance. Don't worry about it. Not the automated system is the authoritative source. Just log both and move on. Don't ask which one is right. Because the question of which reading was right was exactly the wrong question to be spending time on, apparently. Someone knew that. Someone had known that before I arrived and had written it into the rules. I read the rules again. All 11 printed ones, plus the 2 handwritten additions, I wasn't supposed to be examining yet. Rule 5 landed differently the second time. Do not attempt to determine which reading is correct. But the instructions for my job, the reason I was here, the reason any human tech is deployed to a remote station during high-consequence forecast windows was to provide a verification check on the automated system, to provide a human reading against which the automated reading could be compared. If there was a discrepancy, the protocol was to assess, to determine the more likely accurate reading, and to flag the appropriate correction to the regional office. Rule 5 told me not to do that. Rule 5 told me to log both and move on. Which meant the rules were, at a minimum, in tension with my formal job description. And someone had known that and had left the rules anyway. I looked at the slope above the instrument shelter through the small north-facing window. It was past midnight. The floodlights lit the path between the buildings and their range fell about 10 meters past the instrument shelter door before losing coherence and dissolving into the darkness of the slope. Above the shelter, the slope was invisible. I could see the silhouettes of the leaning trees at the edge of the light. Beyond them, nothing, a textured dark. At 1:47 a.m., I felt the quality of the silence above the shelter change again. I noted the time. I did not use the floodlights to look. At my 3 a.m. reading, the discrepancy had grown. 0.4 degrees, 3 millibars, 5% humidity. Ardell's numbers. I was producing Ardell's numbers now. And Ardell's rotation had been 14 nights long. I was on night 2. I logged both readings. I moved on. I sat for my 10 minutes after the midnight reading. I had forgotten to do it at midnight because of the logbook. And I sat my 10 minutes after 3 a.m. instead, which may have been wrong, which may have mattered. I did not sleep well in the afternoon before night 3. The third night I read Rule 12. I want to describe what happened before I read it because the before matters. I did my 6 p.m. reading. The discrepancy was 0.5 degrees, 4 millibars, 6% humidity. Growing again. I came back and I sat for my 10 minutes, and during the 10 minutes, I noticed something I had not registered on the previous 2 nights. The logbook, my logbook, the one I'd been filling in, not Ardell's, was open to my night 2 entries. I had left it open. Normal. I write in it. I leave it on the desk. But there was a new entry under my last one. Not below the page, there wasn't room. It had been written in the margins of the existing entry, perpendicular to my lines, in that cramped sideways script that people use when they run out of space and refuse to start a new page. It said, "The margin is not a calibration error. You already know this." The ink was the same as Rules 12 and 13 on the laminated card. The handwriting was mine. I checked my hands, no ink. I checked the pens on the desk, both capped, both with no wet tips. I looked at the clock. I had been outside for 11 minutes at the 6 p.m. reading, and then I had come back and sat down, and that was it. I had not written in the logbook. I picked up the laminated card. Do not read Rule 12 until your third night. It was my third night. I read it. Rule 12 was longer than the others. It was also in my handwriting, but this time on a small piece of paper that had been slipped under the laminate before it was sealed or after it was sealed. But before I found it, the paper inserted so carefully under the edge that I'd missed it on my first 2 reads. I eased it out. It said, "The readings are not a calibration error. The automated sensors are reading correctly for what they are measuring. Your instruments are also reading correctly. They're measuring different things. The station's sensors measure the ambient conditions. Your instruments measure the conditions where something is standing. You've been standing in the same place each time. So has it. This is the margin." I set the paper down. I picked it up again. It took me a long time to think through what it was saying, and then it took me longer to think through the implication. And then I sat for a while with the implication before I accepted it. The automated sensors and my manual instruments were both accurate. They were both reading correctly. They disagreed because they were measuring different things. Specifically, my manual readings had been consistently higher than the automated baseline. Higher temperature, higher pressure, higher humidity. Something was standing in the instrument shelter with me. Something warm, something that displaced air, something that changed the local microclimate of a small enclosed space by the presence of its body, because that is what warm bodies do. That is the physics of it. That is why indoor temperature readings always correct for occupancy, because people in a room raise the temperature and humidity of that room. I had been taking readings inside a small enclosed shelter with another presence, and my instruments had been measuring the combined microclimate. The automated sensors mounted at height and in a different configuration were reading the ambient conditions outside that local disturbance. The margin was a body. The margin had grown across Ula's rotation and Ardell's rotation and into mine because the body had been getting warmer, or closer, or more present, or some combination of those things, approaching something, approaching some kind of threshold. I reread Rule 6. Do not stand outside the instrument shelter after completing a reading. Take your readings, log them inside the shelter. Leave promptly. Not leave as fast as you can. Not run. Leave promptly. Because leaving promptly was the only reason I wasn't still in there right now. I reread Rule 3. Do not leave the instrument shelter door open while taking readings. Close the door behind you before you leave, not to keep the wind out, to not leave the door open, to not provide an exit. I sat with the rules for a long time. Then I read Rule 13. Rule 13 was on the back of the small piece of paper. It said, go to the coordinates below at 3:12 a.m. tonight. Bring the logbook. Do not bring a light. Stand at the coordinates for as long as it takes. You will know when to come back. When you come back, write the rules down in full. Write everything you found there. Write it clearly for the next person. That is the only thing you need to do. Below that were two numbers, decimal degrees, latitude and longitude. I didn't need to look them up on a map. I knew the station's coordinates well enough to know that the location Rule 13 was sending me to was approximately 30 meters beyond the instrument shelter, in the direction of the slope, in the area that the floodlights didn't reach. I checked the time. It was 11:23 p.m. I had a little under 4 hours. I want to be honest about what those 4 hours felt like, because I think it's important and because I think you will understand. I am not a brave person. I want to be clear about that. I am a careful person, which is different. Brave people make calculations about risk and decide the risk is acceptable. Careful people avoid the situations where the calculation becomes necessary. I had spent 18 months becoming as careful as possible, taking contracts that were remote and isolated and low stakes and procedurally defined, because procedurally defined work was the closest I could get to certainty, and certainty was what I needed after what had happened. Here is what happened. 18 months before I arrived at RWOS 7, I was working a verification shift at a lowland station during a red flag fire weather event. The automated readings were showing wind speeds and humidity levels that were borderline just inside the threshold for issuing a red flag warning extension that would have kept suppression crews out of the field until conditions improved. My manual readings were consistently slightly higher than the automated output. My readings, if taken as authoritative, would have pushed the conditions over the threshold, would have meant keeping crews out. I thought carefully and professionally about whether to flag the discrepancy. I looked at my instruments. I thought about calibration drift. I thought about the cost of being wrong in either direction. I looked at the sky, which is a thing met techs do, and a thing that is legitimately informative. And the sky told me nothing definitive. I filed my readings as within tolerance of the automated output and let the on-call forecaster use the automated data to make the call. The forecaster judged conditions acceptable. Crews went into the field. The conditions were not acceptable. They deteriorated rapidly, as sometimes conditions do, in ways that nobody, not the automated system, not the forecaster, not me, had predicted. 2 crew members were injured, nothing fatal. But the incident review looked at every data point in the chain, and my readings were in the chain, and in the incident review my supervisor asked me carefully and professionally whether my manual readings had in fact differed from the automated output that day. I said they'd been within tolerance. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Within tolerance or within the margin you decided to call tolerance?" I didn't answer. The review found no fault with my call. Officially, the conditions had been legitimately borderline and the deterioration had been rapid and unpredictable, and there was no finding that my readings had contributed materially to the outcome. Officially. But I knew what I'd done. I had trusted the system over my own reading because I was afraid of being wrong. I had seen a discrepancy and called it calibration drift because the alternative that my instruments were right and the system was off meant making a call, and making a call meant being responsible, and being responsible meant being wrong was possible, and I had decided in a fraction of a second that the system was safer to trust than myself. I had been wrong in the most important way, the one where being wrong cost someone else. So I took remote contracts. So I became the man who verified numbers rather than the man who made calls. So I followed the rules. And now, the rules written in my hand, on paper I hadn't touched, in ink I hadn't used, were sending me into the dark at 3:12 in the morning to stand at a set of coordinates 30 meters past the place where something warm had been standing beside me for 3 nights and waiting for me to understand what I was measuring. I thought about Rule 13 for 4 hours. The instrument shelter visits at midnight and 3 a.m. fell within those 4 hours. I did both readings. At midnight, the discrepancy was 0.7 degrees, 6 millibars, 8% humidity, growing faster now. At 3 a.m. it jumped again, 1.1 degrees, 9 millibars, 12%. The presence in the shelter was getting very warm. At midnight I sat my 10 minutes. During the 10 minutes, something on the slope above the shelter made the air change its quality the same way it had the previous 2 nights, that occupied silence, that listening stillness. I noted the time, 0:41. At 3:09 a.m., I put on my jacket. I picked up the logbook. I stood at the main shelter door. I did not bring a light. The floodlights covered the path between the buildings in their full reach past the instrument shelter. Beyond that reach, the slope rose into darkness. I stood at the edge of the light for a moment, looking at the place where it dissolved. The gravel under my feet made that hollow sound. The wind was almost nothing, just a faint movement at the back of the neck, the kind of wind that is less a wind than a reminder that air has pressure. I stepped past the instrument shelter and into the dark. I want to try to describe this accurately, which is hard because accurate description of something you don't have a framework for tends to sound like bad metaphor. I will try to stick to what I actually perceived. The slope above the instrument shelter was rocky and uneven, the kind of footing that in daylight would require attention and in darkness required either a light or very slow movement. I moved slowly. My eyes adjusted as well as eyes adjust in that kind of darkness, which is to say, partially, enough to see the difference between a rock and empty air, enough to see the shapes of the leaning trees against the sky, which had the faint luminosity of a sky with cloud cover and no moon. Not enough to read anything, not enough to see details. I found the coordinates by dead reckoning, which is the only way to find a precise location in darkness without instruments. I knew the station's position. I knew the bearing from the instrument shelter. I counted my steps. It took me about 3 minutes to reach the location Rule 13 had given me. I stood there. The cold was significant at 4,000 feet in the dark, but it was a dry cold, the kind that doesn't feel as dangerous as it is, the kind that med techs in remote postings are warned about, specifically because it fails to register as urgency. I registered it but did not feel urgency. I felt very still. I want to be precise about what I heard, because I think hearing is more trustworthy than seeing in that context, and because what I heard is the part I am most certain about. I heard breathing, not my own breathing. I know its rhythm and its depth and the faint sound of it in the back of my sinuses when I'm cold and the air is dry. This was a different rhythm, slower, deeper. The interval between inhale and exhale was longer than a human breath, or shorter. I'm genuinely not sure. It seemed to shift. It seemed to not be quite fixed, the way a rhythm is not fixed when something is paying attention to something else, and its breathing is only incidental to its main occupation. Its main occupation was looking at me. I felt that. I know how that sounds. I felt the direction of attention the way you feel it in a dark room when you know someone is there. A kind of convergence, a sense of being the point that something is pointed at. I was standing at the coordinates and something was very close to me in the dark, and it was paying attention to me with the intensity of something that had been waiting for this moment for a long time. I did not move. I did not speak. I held the logbook against my chest because that is what my hands did, and I don't have a better explanation. I stood there, and here is what I know happened, stated as plainly as I can manage. I understood something, not in words, not through any process of reasoning I can fully reconstruct. I simply understood. The way you understand, sometimes, that a room you've walked into is wrong before you can identify what's wrong about it. The understanding arrived complete, the way knowledge arrives sometimes in the moment before sleep, clear and whole and without a trail of argument behind it. I understood what the margin was. The margin between my readings and the automated readings was not a calibration error. The automated sensors were reading the ambient conditions of this slope correctly. My manual instruments, inside the shelter, were reading the conditions around a presence that had been in the shelter with me each time I visited. The presence was warm. It was warm in a way that affected local temperature, local pressure, local humidity. It was warm the way living things are warm, not the warmth of machinery, not the warmth of a chemical process, but the warmth of something metabolically active, something that had heat as a byproduct of its continuing existence. It was not hiding in the shelter. It was sheltering in the shelter. The way animals shelter, the way anything that is cold and made of heat-producing tissue seeks enclosed spaces in cold conditions. It was not doing anything to me during the readings. It was doing what I was doing, taking readings of its own kind in its own way, from the one enclosed space on this slope that provided cover. We had been sharing the instrument shelter for 3 nights without event because we were both, in our own ways, trying to get accurate measurements of the same conditions. The discrepancy was the overlap. The overlap was the margin. The margin was the evidence that we had been briefly, repeatedly, sharing the same small space, each affecting the conditions the other was trying to measure. I stood at the coordinates for I don't know exactly how long. Long enough. The logbook tells me I came back inside at 4:51 a.m., which means I was out there for an hour and 39 minutes, though the time on the slope felt both shorter and longer than that. In the way that time does when you are not thinking about time at all, I know when I knew it was time to come back. The breathing changed. The attention shifted. The way attention shifts when something has finished looking and has turned towards something else. The sense of being the point that something is pointed at dissolved, and I was simply standing on a cold slope in the dark, alone. And it was cold, and I should go inside. I went inside. I sat down at the desk. The logbook was in my hands. The instrument panel was cycling through its outputs. The relay click of the 15-minute transmission, everything nominal. Everything reading within the automated baseline, because whatever had been in the shelter was on the slope now, and the shelter was empty. I looked at the rules. Rule 13. Write the rules down in full. Write everything you found there. Write it clearly for the next person. That is the only thing you need to do. I understood the rules now, in the same way I had understood the margin completely, without a trail of argument. The rules were not instructions for surviving the station. They were instructions for coexisting with it. Whatever came to this slope, whatever had been coming to this slope for at least as long as Uhl's rotation, possibly longer, it was not a threat. It was a presence. It was something that operated on this slope and used the instrument shelter as shelter in the same way I used the main building because it was the most reasonable option available, because this particular enclosed space provided cover from the conditions, because the thing had its own version of the need for shelter, and this slope had one. The rules manage the coexistence. Don't linger in the shelter, because lingering unnecessarily extended the overlap. Don't use the floodlights to look at the slope, because illuminating the slope unnecessarily disturbed something that needed the dark for its own purposes. Sit 10 minutes after the midnight reading, because the midnight reading was when the presence was most active on the slope, most close to the shelter, and 10 minutes of stillness inside the main building gave it room to complete whatever it was doing without a human moving around in the instrument shelter. Log both readings. Don't try to determine which is correct, because both were correct. Because both readings were accurate measurements of the conditions in the shelter at the time, which varied depending on whether the presence was in the shelter with me or had moved outside before I arrived. The rules were not warnings, they were protocols. They had been written by someone who had stood where I stood at 3:12 a.m. and come back and understood what needed to be documented. Written by me. I looked at the laminated card again, the printed 11 rules, and my handwritten 2. I looked at the handwriting on the margins of the logbook. I looked at the piece of paper that had been under the laminate. I had not written any of these things. I had arrived 4 nights ago, and I had not written any of them. But I had just spent an hour and 39 minutes on a dark slope at 4,000 feet, and I had come back understanding something I had not understood before. And now the act of writing it down for the next person felt right, felt necessary, felt like the only thing I needed to do, which is what Rule 13 said. So either the rules had been written by someone else, someone before me, whose handwriting I happened to share, which is possible, but which felt wrong in the particular way that wrong numbers feel wrong when you've spent enough time with numbers. Or I had written them during some interval I didn't have access to, some window of time between the person who arrived at the station and the person who stood on the slope and understood. Or the distinction didn't matter as much as I was making it matter. The rule said to write the rules down clearly for the next person. I picked up a pen. What I wrote took the rest of the night and part of the morning. I wrote the rules as I understood them now, which was differently than I had understood them on arrival. I wrote them as a coherent document, not a laminated card, not margin notes, but a full explanation of what each rule was for and why it mattered and what the consequences of not following it were, to the extent I understood the consequences. I wrote about the margin. I wrote about the presence in the shelter. I wrote about the slope and the breathing and the 10-minute sit after the midnight reading and why the 10 minutes existed. I wrote about what it felt like to stand at the coordinates, which was the hardest part to write clearly. Because clarity about subjective experience requires a vocabulary I am not sure I have for this particular experience. I tried anyway. I wrote, "It is paying attention to you. It is not threatening you. It is assessing you. The way you assess a new instrument or trying to determine the nature of the thing before incorporating it into its operational picture. Stand still. Do not try to see it. Let it assess you. When the attention shifts, come back inside." I wrote about the readings and the discrepancy pattern and how the margin grew across rotations and what the growing margin indicated, which was not that the thing was getting closer in a spatial sense, but that it was becoming more present, more locally dense, more corporeal in the shelter in some way that I don't have better language for. I wrote, "This is not a threat. This is a signature. It is telling you what is there the only way it knows how to tell you, which is by being there and being warm." And then I wrote about the question of authorship, the thing I still don't have a clean answer to, because here is what I know and cannot explain. The rules exist. The rules are accurate. The rules describe the correct protocols for managing this situation, and they describe them in enough detail to have been written by someone with direct experience of the situation. The handwriting is mine. The rules were in place before my arrival. These facts coexist, and I cannot fully reconcile them, and I have stopped trying to reconcile them the same way Rule 5 told me to stop trying to determine which reading was correct. Both readings were correct. Both things are true. The rules were there before I arrived, and the rules are written in my hand. And these two facts are in tension only if I insist that time has a single direction, and that authorship requires the author to have existed before the authored thing. I spent a long time in my life insisting on those things. I am less insistent now. What I think, and this is interpretation, this is the kind of personal observation Rule 11 says, to leave out of the handover notes. But this is not the handover notes. This is the full document. This is the thing Rule 13 asked for. What I think is that this station has had many techs, and that the techs who were careful enough and present enough and attentive enough all eventually stood on that slope and understood something, and the rules are the accumulation of that understanding, layered, passed forward. The handwriting changes by tech, but the understanding is continuous. The understanding is the same thing, written through different hands. I may have written those rules 18 months from now, on some other night, at some other station or this one again, having spent the interval between arriving and understanding, carrying the knowledge in my body before my mind caught up to it. I don't know. I don't know the mechanism. I know only that the rules are accurate and that I was correct about the readings 18 months ago and that the two facts are related in a way that feels important. I was correct about the readings 18 months ago. My manual readings were consistently slightly higher than the automated output. I had called it calibration drift. I had decided to trust the system rather than my own assessment. I was right and I knew it, and I decided to call it something else because being right meant making a call, and making a call meant being responsible for the consequences of the call. The thing on the slope, whatever it is, whatever the right vocabulary is, it has been warming the instrument shelter for years. Uhl's readings, Ardell's readings, mine. The margin grows because something is approaching, slowly, some threshold I don't fully understand, but which has been accumulating over multiple rotations. My readings were not wrong. My readings were capturing a real presence, a real local condition, a real discrepancy from the automated baseline. I was right 18 months ago, too. Something was there. I measured it. I decided I couldn't trust what I was measuring, and I let the system override my reading. And two people were in the field in conditions I had the instruments and the instincts to flag as marginal. And the conditions were marginal. And they got hurt. I don't know what to do with that. I'm still not sure what to do with that. But I know that I have spent 18 months becoming a man who trusts external systems over his own reading, because trusting himself felt too dangerous. And I know that the rules which are, on some level, mine sent me onto that slope specifically to recover the one thing I'd been hiding from. The margin is not a calibration error. You already know this. I wrote that in my logbook before I read Rule 12. Some part of me knew it before the rest of me was ready to know it. I need to tell you what happened on the remaining 11 nights. And I need to tell you honestly, which means telling you that most of them were routine. The readings continued to show the same discrepancy pattern. The margin grew more slowly after night 3, as if the threshold the presence had been approaching had stabilized, or as if some variable in the coexistence equation had shifted toward equilibrium. I continued to take readings 4 times a shift. I continued to log both values. I sat my 10 minutes after the midnight reading with a kind of intention I hadn't brought to it before, not as a rule to follow, but as a period of genuine stillness that I was grateful for. The way you are grateful for a structure that gives you permission to stop moving. I heard the slope change quality on most nights. Not every night. There were 2 nights, night 7 and night 10, where the slope felt simply empty and the silence was ordinary silence, and I noted this and moved on. I did not return to the coordinates. Rule 13 had not said to go more than once. I did not feel the need. The presence in the shelter continued to register in the readings. Once, on night 8, at the 3 a.m. reading, I turned from the instruments to log a value, and the temperature in the shelter dropped 2 degrees in the space of about 30 seconds, and the pressure held, and the humidity dropped slightly, and then everything normalized, like a breath held and released. I logged it as an anomalous transient reading and noted that both instruments had registered simultaneously and noted the time. I did not try to determine the cause. On night 11, I came back from the midnight reading and sat my 10 minutes, and during the 10 minutes, the logbook opened to a new page by itself. The wind was not blowing. There was no draft. The pages are a mid-weight stock that doesn't move easily. The book opened to a blank page and stayed there. I looked at it for the 10 minutes. When the 10 minutes were done, I wrote in the blank space. I wrote, "I'm still here. I'm still listening." I didn't know who I was writing to. I wrote it anyway. In the morning, the page was blank again, my writing gone, the page slightly warmer than the surrounding pages when I pressed my hand flat against it. Slightly warmer, the way a chair is warm when someone has just gotten up. There is one more thing I need to tell you, and then I will tell you Rule 13 in full, and then this account will be what Rule 13 asked for. On night 12, I broke Rule 9. I heard the slope change quality at 1:15 a.m., the familiar occupied silence, and I stood up from the desk and I turned on the additional exterior floodlights, the ones that illuminated not the path between the buildings, but the area above and to the northwest of the instrument shelter, the slope area, the area the standard floods didn't reach. I don't know exactly why. 12 nights of following the rules, 12 nights of not looking at the slope, and then on night 12, I turned on the lights. I think, and this is personal observation, which the handover notes exclude, but which this document includes. I think I turned on the lights because I wanted to know if I could and then choose not to. I wanted to test whether the rule's authority over me was absolute or whether it was a rule I was choosing to follow. There is a difference. I had spent 18 months following rules because rules felt safer than judgment. I needed to know whether that was still true, whether I was choosing the rules or whether the rules were choosing me. I turned on the lights. The slope was visible, rocky, sparse trees leaning away from the prevailing wind, dry grass in the lower areas, frost pale, empty as far as I could see. Then, at the far edge of the illuminated area, where the floodlights reached dissolved into ambient darkness something, not a shape. I want to be careful here. Not a defined shape with edges and mass the way an animal or a person would have. More like the difference between shadow and absence of light. A volume that the light behaved differently around, not absorbed, not reflected, just slightly reorganized, the way light behaves around heat. That slight shimmer, that refractive quality that is not visible to the naked eye at standard temperatures but becomes perceptible at higher heat differentials. It was there, at the edge of the light. It was warm enough to refract. I looked at it for maybe 15 seconds. Then I turned off the additional floods. I sat back down at the desk. I picked up the pen and I wrote in the logbook. Night 12, 1:15 a.m., broke Rule 9. Turned on exterior floods above shelter. Visible heat differential at edge of illuminated zone, northwest bearing from shelter door, approximately 45 meters. Duration of observation 15 seconds. Turned lights off. No further engagement. Note for next tech. Rule 9 is correct. And that was that. I want to be honest. I was afraid when I saw it. My hands were not steady when I wrote the logbook entry. But the fear was not the kind of fear that makes you want to run. It was the kind of fear that attends significant things. The fear that is really a form of recognition. The body's acknowledgement that what you are seeing is real and large and beyond your prior frame of reference. It was real, it was large, in the sense of being something that exceeded my categories. And it was, in some way I want to be careful not to overstate, not indifferent to me. The attention I had felt on the slope on night 3, the convergence, the sense of being the point that something is pointed at. I felt it again in those 15 seconds, not threatening, not inviting, assessing. I turned off the lights because I didn't want to prolong an assessment that was going fine. Night 14 was my last shift. My relief was scheduled to arrive at 8 a.m., and I wanted to be awake and ready when she arrived, which meant I wanted to complete everything during the shift and sleep in the afternoon and meet her at the car. I wanted the station to be in good order. I did all 4 readings, all within the established discrepancy margin, which had stabilized at 0.9 degrees, 7 millibars, 10% humidity across the final several nights, settling in like a set point, like an equilibrium reached. I logged everything. I wrote the handover notes, equipment nominal, readings within established operational parameters, wildlife activity moderate on most nights, 1 incident of additional floodlight use on night 12, logged. No other protocol deviations. I did not include what I am writing now in the handover notes, because Rule 11 says facts only, no personal observations or interpretations. I sat my 10 minutes after the midnight reading, and I thought about the man who had arrived at this station 14 nights ago. The man who was so committed to following rules that he had spent a year and a half refusing to trust his own reading, who had decided that external systems were safer than internal judgment because internal judgment had cost him something, or had threatened to cost him something, or had cost someone else something that he felt was his to have prevented. He was not, it turned out, wrong to trust the rules. The rules were good. The rules worked. But he had been following them the way a man follows rules when he doesn't trust himself as a substitute for judgment, rather than a framework for it. A rule followed from fear is a different thing from a rule followed from understanding. They produce the same behavior most of the time. Occasionally, they produce opposite behavior. On night 12, I had broken Rule 9 and then documented the break and endorsed the rule. That was judgment. That was the rules and judgment working together. That was what it felt like to be the kind of technician I had been before the incident, before I decided that being right was too expensive. At 5:45 a.m. on night 14, 15 minutes before the shift officially ended, I opened a fresh page in the logbook and I wrote Rule 13 out in full. Here it is. This is what Rule 13 actually says, the full text, not just the version I described earlier, which was the version I found on night 1, before I understood what it meant. When your rotation ends, write a full account of what you found here. Not the handover notes, those are for the next tech's operational briefing. A full account, write it for whoever comes after the next tech, or the one after that, or whoever is careful enough and present enough to need it. Write it clearly. Don't make it sound more than it is, and don't make it sound less. The thing on this slope is real. It is not your enemy. It is not your friend. It is large in the way that things are large when they predate your category for them. The station exists here because the slope is measurable, and the thing exists here because the slope is its home, and you exist here because someone needs to verify that the measurements are honest. All three of these things can be true at once. They have been true for longer than this station has existed. The margin will grow across your rotation and it will stabilize. It stabilizes because, after a certain number of visits, the presence in the shelter has learned your microclimate well enough to compensate for it, to stand in the shelter with you and adjust its own local effect so that you are reading the ambient conditions rather than the combined microclimate. This takes time. The growing margin is the learning curve. The plateau is the accommodation. You are not in danger during this period. You are being calibrated. Go to the slope on your third night. Stand at the coordinates. Bring the logbook. Do not bring a light. You will feel what is there. Come back when the attention shifts. Write down everything you understood. Do not be afraid of your own reading. You were sent here because you are accurate. The regional office does not know that the main qualification for this posting is accuracy of perception, the ability to trust your instruments even when they contradict the system. But it is. Every tech who has worked this station was sent here because something in their record indicated they were good at knowing when a reading was right, even if the official output said otherwise. You are here because of your discrepancy, not in spite of it. Your discrepancy. You know what it is. The incident that made you doubt yourself. The reading you got that didn't match the system. The call you didn't make. You were right. You were right, and you knew it, and you decided to call it something else. That is what brought you here. The posting finds the people who were right and didn't trust it. Trust your reading. That is the only rule that matters. The rest are logistics. I sat with that for a long time. Then I put the pen down and closed the logbook and looked out the small north-facing window at the slope, which was lightening now with the pre-dawn, the particular gray-blue that comes before the actual gray of first light, and in that light the leaning trees were just trees, and the slope was just a slope, and the instrument shelter sat at its 30-meter remove, and nothing moved. Nothing I could see. I thought about the incident review, the official finding that my readings had been within tolerance, the question my supervisor had asked. Within tolerance or within the margin you decided to call tolerance? I had not answered. I should have answered. The answer was, I decided. I looked at the margin and I decided it was calibration drift, because deciding it was real meant making a call I was afraid to make. I was right about the readings. The readings were real. What I measured was what was there. I have spent 18 months unlearning that. I picked up the logbook again, and I read back through my entries, all 14 nights, and I read back through Ardell's logbook, and I thought about Ool, whose logbook I hadn't found, who might have written one like this that had been lost or removed or that existed somewhere in a filing system at the regional office. I thought, how many of us have there been? How many careful people, accurate people, people who got readings that didn't match the official output and called it calibration drift, and then doubted themselves into a remote posting to verify other people's numbers? How many of us has this slope calibrated? I didn't know. I didn't need to know. I needed to write the account and leave it in the lower desk drawer where the next careful person would find it, which is what I did. And then I added the rules, all 13 of them, written out fully with context and explanation, onto a fresh laminated card. There was a laminator in the supply kit, which I had not registered as significant until that moment, and I left the card on the desk where I had found it, with my handwriting on Rules 12 and 13, the way I had found it. My relief arrived at 8:23 a.m. Her name was Pereira. She was younger than me, efficient, professional, with the slightly preoccupied energy of someone mentally already inside the task. She asked standard questions: propane level, water, radio status, any equipment issues. I gave her the handover notes. Facts only. She looked at the laminated card. 13 rules, she said. I was told 11. 11 when I arrived, I said. Then 14 nights. She looked at me. She has good instincts. I could see her calibrating whether to ask the next question. I said, read the logbook in the lower desk drawer. Night 3, read Rule 12. She looked at the card. She was counting the rules. I could see her counting. The handwriting on 12 and 13, she said. I know. She looked at me for another moment. Then she nodded, the way people nod when they have decided to trust their reading and proceed. Good instincts. She would be all right. I gathered my gear. I walked out to my truck. The gravel made its hollow sound under my feet. I stopped for a moment at the instrument shelter and looked at the door, just a plain metal door, a simple latch. And then I looked up the slope, which in the morning light was exactly a slope, rocky and sparse and leaning into its prevailing wind. I'm leaving, I said to the slope. I don't know why. It seemed like the right thing to say. The air didn't change. The slope didn't move. It was 8:30 in the morning at 4,000 feet, and the sky was clear and the automated sensors were transmitting their 15-minute output, and Pereira was inside at the desk, beginning the first entries of her logbook. I drove down the access road. I'm writing this at a table in a diner in the valley, 2 days after my rotation ended. And I've been trying to write it since I left the station, and I have written and thrown away several versions that were either too clinical or too the opposite of clinical. I'm trying to find the register that Rule 13 asked for. Not more than it is, not less. The thing on the slope is real. It is not my enemy. It is large in the way that things are large when they predate your category for them. That's close. That's the right register. I don't know what the thing on the slope is. I know its thermal signature and its attention and the sound of its breathing and the way its presence modifies the microclimate of an 11 by 8 foot instrument shelter. I know it's been on that slope for longer than the station has existed. I know it comes to the shelter when the readings are being taken, which may be coincidence and may be something else, curiosity, or the warmth of the instruments, or the overlap between its own reading of conditions and mine. I know the margin is not a calibration error. I know I was right 18 months ago. I know the reading was real. I know I measured something that was there, warm and present and modifying the local microclimate, and I know I called it noise because being right was frightening. I know that the injury wasn't caused by my silence, not directly, not in a clean causal chain. The conditions deteriorated in ways that nobody predicted, and the review found no fault with my call. Officially. I know that officially doesn't stop being a weight I carry. I know I can hold both of those things. The weight of what happened and the fact that I was right. They're both true. They're not in tension the way I thought they were. Being right didn't cost those people anything. Calling it something else didn't save them anything. The weight is not about the call. The weight is about having learned in that moment that I would rather doubt myself than be wrong, which is a posture that over time becomes its own kind of harm. I have been harming myself for 18 months with very good protocol. The rules were written in my hand because my hand is the one that needed to write them. The slope found me because I was accurate and afraid, and accuracy and fear in the same person is the kind of discrepancy that this posting exists to resolve. I'm resolved. Provisionally. The way anything is resolved provisionally when the resolution requires daily renegotiation rather than a single complete event. I have a consultation call with the regional office next week about my next posting. I am going to ask for a verification posting with more operational decision-making, a posting where I am not only checking someone else's output but generating my own, a posting where I have to trust my reading. I'm going to trust my reading. There is one thing I haven't explained and will not fully explain, because I'm not sure the explanation is knowable. On my last read-through of the logbook, the night before Pereira arrived, I noticed something in Ardell's entries that I had not registered when I first read them. Ardell's discrepancy margins the 0.4 degrees, 3 millibars, 5% humidity that I mentioned earlier are exactly the values I was recording on night 2. Precisely, to the decimal. And Ardell's final entry, written on his last night, concludes with a note that is not really a note, more of a final observation, in handwriting that is shakier than the rest of his entries, like it was written quickly or in cold. The next tech will have my numbers on night 2. Then they'll push further. Then they'll stabilize where I stabilized. The slope is teaching them what it taught me, what it teaches everyone who comes here. Don't ask me to explain the mechanism. I don't know the mechanism. I know the slope is a patient teacher and it knows what it's looking for. The next tech will be someone who didn't trust their reading, who needs to learn it again. Hope they go to the slope on night 3. It's easier if you go on night 3. I thought about that for a while. Then I wrote below it, in the same logbook, in my handwriting. I went on night 3. It was easier. And below that, the next one should go on night 3 too. Tell them. That's what I'm doing. If you're the next tech at RWOS7, or if you're a tech at any station where your readings don't quite agree with the automated output, where the discrepancy is consistent and growing and feels wrong in the particular way that wrong numbers feel wrong, trust your reading. Don't try to determine which reading is correct. Log both readings and sit with the question for as long as it takes. Go to the place the question is asking you to go. Don't bring a light. Bring the logbook. Stand at the coordinates until the attention shifts. Come back and write it down. That's all. Those are the rules, except for one thing. One thing I wrote in the full account that I left in the lower desk drawer that I haven't included here, that I'm not going to include here. Not because it's dangerous, not because it would frighten you, because it's the kind of thing that is only true when you're standing in the place where it becomes true, and writing it down flattens it into something it isn't, something too small, and I don't want to do that to it. It told me something on the slope in that hour and 39 minutes. Not in words, in the way it told me everything else complete, whole, without a visible chain of argument. A single piece of information that I received without asking for it and that I have been carrying since night 3. I don't know if every tech gets it. I don't know if it's the same information or different for everyone. I don't know if it matters. I just know that I have it now, and it's warm, and it goes with me. And every morning when I wake up, I put my hand on my chest and feel it there, a slight extra warmth, a degree above ambient, a margin that wasn't there before. I don't try to determine what it is. I already know what it is. It is real.